Shabbat Shalom. What holiday is right around the corner? Purim, exactly right. And of the many activities we do on Purim, there is one that is, just so much fun. And I'm not talking about the drinking. If you want to know more about the drinking, check out my last Wednesday class on YouTube already, where I go into great detail about how and how not to engage in that particular activity. No, I'm talking about the wearing of costumes. This is an embellishment of our celebration. It's not technically a mitzvah. So if you show up to the Megillah reading without wearing a costume, I'm not going to tell you, that you're breaking a commandment, but the costumes are really at the heart of the story. Now that may be a little surprising. The drinking we see in the story, they are drinking from page 1, and there's drinking almost all the way through. But the costume, where's that in the story? All right, well, let's understand the basic origin of the wearing of a costume in relationship to the holiday of Purim. So who is the hero of the story? Esther. Make sure you get that right. The book's literally named for her people, right? So it shouldn't be a trick question. Esther is the hero. We also know she's the hero because, according to normal literary theory, the hero is the character who has the greatest transformation. Everybody else in the story is the same as they were at the end as they were at the beginning, except for Haman, who's now dead. But he's still the same guy. He's just now lifeless. Whereas Esther is transformed from being the nice girl, the one who always does what other people want, the one that others project their view onto her of what goodness is, and she's just sort of along for the ride. And by the end of the story, of course, she is a magnificent queen who is giving orders to Ahasuerus, and she is not only saving her people, but restructuring the entire Persian Empire. That's some pretty major transformation. But at the beginning, that's not who she is. And at the beginning, she is actually told, don't tell them who you are. If you read through the Megillah carefully, and you all better, because that actually is a mitzvah, Mordechai tells her when she is chosen to go into the king's palace, to not tell anybody who her people are. Don't tell them you're a Jew. Essentially, he tells her, put on a costume. You're going to go into the king's harem, and you're going to have to wear a costume. And I'm not just talking about the I Dream a Genie harem costume. I mean, you're going to have to hide who you are. Don't tell them you're a Jew. Now, we don't get a lot of explanation in the book itself for why he gives her those instructions. And so we have to look to extra textual insights to try and figure this out. So what do we know about the Persian Empire? And this we do get corroboration in the story. It is a multi-ethnic community. The Persian Empire stretches all the way from India to Ethiopia. It covers a huge swath of the world, and it covers a huge, diverse number of different people. Sometimes we forget that we, that is to say the Jewish people, in Judea, in that little province along the Eastern Mediterranean, we were still part of the Persian Empire at the same time that Esther was being taken into the king's palace. It was not an independent country. In fact, none of those countries were independent. They were ruled by Persia with a light touch. That is to say, you send the taxes, you don't make any trouble, you have laws that we're okay with, and we'll leave you alone, more or less. That was the deal in the multi-ethnic empires throughout most of history. And Persia wasn't the only one. The Roman Empire was very similar. There were different imperial phases of China and India that were very similar. Austro-Hungarian, if you want to go more European, were very similar, ruling over multi-ethnic groups. Well, there is one problem with ruling over multi-ethnic groups in that kind of way, which is that oftentimes the different ethnic groups will jockey for position, that they will each want to rise higher in the esteem of the central government, and they'll often do so by plotting and scheming against one another in order to gain more status or degrade the status of their rivals. We saw this very clearly in former Yugoslavia, where all of those ethnic groups decided that now was the time to sharpen the knives once again, settle old scores. Mordechai is concerned that if people know that Esther is a Jew, that this could have two very bad effects. One, people could target her in the court politics because she's a Jew, because If they don't like Jews, they're not going to want her to be in a strong position within the court, because then she would be able to help the Jews. Lo and behold, that's exactly what happens. And two, the opposite, that if she does something wrong, if she gets caught up in something, he is concerned that it will come back to bite the Jews, because she would be representing their people within that court, and thus she would be, unfortunately, a lightning rod that could conduct anger, not just for herself, but out into the Jewish world as well. Of course, the exact opposite happens. It's Mordechai who conducts the lightning and ends up causing the crisis and catastrophe for all of the Jewish people, but we do see that his basic idea was a valid one, which is to say, people might not only get mad at you, they might get mad at all of us because you're one of us. So for now, costume mode. For now, don't tell them who you are. And that's exactly what she does. And as such, she is able to navigate the halls of power within the Persian Empire and rise to become the chief wife. Now, queen is a bit of an error, because queens didn't have exactly the same power there as they would later on in other countries, but she did amass a fair degree of authority within that community and respect. And that, of course, becomes immensely important later in the story when Haman has now hatched his plot, and Mordechai and the rest of the Jews who are out as Jews are now under a threat of death. She is able to, voila, reveal herself as being Jewish, and as such, because she has staged things just right with her idiot husband, able to convince him to allow the Jews to defend themselves so that we are eventually saved. So, the costume is central. If she had been known as a Jew, Haman would have behaved very differently. He probably still would have tried to exterminate us, but he would have already known who the players were before he began, and he would have had a better ability to neutralize Esther and thus neutralize the source of our redemption. So, the costume was critical. Wear a costume. We're all good? But so was the reveal. Esther has to reveal who she is for the story to actually work, for there to be a redemption. There has to be a moment where she says, you know what? I've been hiding so long, and I know I probably maybe sort of could stay safe. Mordechai warns her maybe not, but kind of maybe she could have. But she still has to realize, to be true to herself, she has to take off that costume. She has to out herself as being a Jew within this court and take the risk in order to be able to win the victory for her people. And it's a tough choice when you have been playing it safe for so long, when you have been willing to be in the background for so long. It's hard sometimes to eventually realize this is the moment when the costume has to come off, and I'm going to show you what I really believe. And that is what we need to do right now for the state of Israel. I know it's going to sound weird, criticizing the government of Israel while she's in the midst of another round of military exchanges with the country of Iran. But that is exactly the costume that we have been wearing for the last 80 years. For 80 years, the conservative movement and other non-Orthodox Jews have essentially worn the costume that we're okay with the way Israel treats the non-Orthodox Jews under her jurisdiction. We have done so for the sake of peace. We have done so for the sake of war. We have done so that no one would claim that we were being divisive or antagonistic to the state of Israel or undermining her reason for existence or all of those other wonderful slogans. But the fact is that it is reaching a breaking point, and we have to actually speak up out and loud, just as Esther did, if we want things to get better, not just for our brothers and sisters in the conservative movement in Israel, but for all the other Israelis that live there as well, including the Orthodox, who are being increasingly held captive by the rabbinic system that has been allowed to perpetuate and amass power since the beginning of the state. It was nothing like that in 1948, mind you. But over the decades, as successive governments have traded political favors, the Rabbanut, the official Orthodox rabbinic system within Israel, has amassed greater and greater power over individual life, and in this particular month's news, over how we can pray. Israel is the only country in Western world where Jews do not have a freedom of religion. Think about that for a moment. If I am in England, if I am in Germany, if I am in France, if I am in Poland, of all places, I can pray as I want and not be afraid of government repression. In Israel, they are now proposing a law that will make it almost inevitable that people like you and me will be spending up to 7 years in prison for praying as we want. Let me give you the lowdown if you're not keeping up with this, and I know that you're not keeping up with everything because there's way too much to keep up with, but this is near and dear to my heart, so I'm a little bit more vested in the topic. More than a decade ago, after decades of wrangling, the Israeli Supreme Court ruled that the government was behaving unconstitutionally. It's a little bit different than Israel, but we'll use that term for the moment, by allowing the Rabbanut, the rabbinic councils of Israel, to prohibit egalitarian prayer at the Kotel, at the wall. If you've been to the wall, and I bet a lot of you here have, or at the very least have seen pictures, you'll know that right up till today, there is a men's section and a women's section, just as if you were walking into an Orthodox synagogue. I will point out the wall is not a synagogue. Rather important. We might need to remember that later. We'll see. So if I wanted to go to the Kotel and pray with my wife or my daughter, I already would have been prohibited from doing so. The conservative movement and many other Jews within Israel had been lobbying for years to be allowed to have a place, just a part of the wall, not to change the entire structure, just a place where we could be allowed to have an egalitarian prayer, where a man and his wife and their children, sons and daughters, could actually stand together or sit together just like you're doing right here. The government had continued to refuse, not because they were so pious, but because they needed to curry favor with the ultra-Orthodox parties that are in the Knesset in order to pass different legislation. And so the government refused. And the Supreme Court finally weighed in and said, you have to do this. And they've allowed, eventually, a rickety scaffolding to be built far to the opposite side of the main entrance ramps, down near what's known as Robinson Arch, hovering in the air above the archaeological section. And that was going to be the egalitarian section, and some of you may have actually been there. Those of you who went on the trip to Israel with me, we had a chance to spend an Erev Shabbat there, and it was beautiful. However, a number of years ago, prior to this 10-year mark that I'm mentioning, there was a little bit of trouble. It's almost like rickety scaffoldings aren't the best solution, and some stones from up above came loose. They damaged part of the platform, and so it was a little bit famished. And that meant that if you were at the platform, you were now a good 20, 30 feet away from the Kotel. You could not reach the wall when they finally repaired the platform. And the Supreme Court said, you have to repair it to provide equal access again. And the government said, oh, yes, we've made a deal. We will do so, no problem. That was 10 years ago when they finally broke that deal and said, no, actually, it's never going to happen. We were lying. We just said that so that everyone would shut up and go home and stop being angry about this. So for 10 years, it has remained in an improper state. And the Supreme Court, again, earlier this month, revisited this topic, thank you guys, and said, what are you doing? 10 years ago, don't give us any more excuses. Fix it, repair it. And along the same vein, the Women of the Wall, that is to say, an organization that supports Orthodox women, praying in the women-only section, but with a Torah, should be allowed to do so as well. Because there is nothing in Orthodoxy or in Jewish law or Israeli law that should prohibit them, and yet they are continually harassed and beaten and thrown out of the Kotel with their Torahs because they have the temerity to think they should be allowed to do something the Jewish law says they have the right to do. But the Rabbanut doesn't want them to. And so the government, taking in the Supreme Court's decision, said, wow, this is a tricky situation. You know what we should do? We should pass a law that says from now on, every holy site is completely and 100% under the jurisdiction of the Rabbanut. That was their solution to go 180 degrees from the opposite direction of what the Supreme Court and every normal person was thinking should be done. And this means that under Israeli law, if the Rabbanut decides that what you are doing constitutes a religious desecration, you will be subject to a 7-year prison sentence. And they, and only they, will be allowed to make that decision, not the Knesset. The Knesset is abdicating its responsibility for legislation to the rabbinic courts to decide who should and who should not be put in jail for what they are doing near what they have deemed a holy site. Do we see the problem? Do we see the problem? You go to the Kotel in shorts. If someone has decided that is inappropriate, boom, jail time for you. You go to the Kotel and maybe your talit is the wrong kind of talit. Maybe you have techelet. They don't like techelet in most of the Orthodox world. Boom, religious desecration because you are provoking them. Literally, that is how the law is written. You are creating a religious provocation, which is a disturbance of the peace, because you are violating the norms of that place. And they expect the country to go along with this. Because if they don't, then the ultra-Orthodox will pull out of the current coalition in the government, and that will mean that there needs to be a new election. And nobody wants that who's among the current governing power, because the people that are currently in the coalition like being in power and are very, very afraid that if there is a new election, that people might actually hold them accountable, for example, of the tragedies of October 7th, which they have continued to avoid having proper investigations and inquests into what went wrong and why that happened, and which they continue to want to not even call a massacre because they think it makes them look weak. So all those people who were killed, they weren't massacred. They just happened to choose to die on the same day for some inexplicable reason. When religion and politics get together, this is what happens, folks. And we need to speak. Now, we are far away, obviously. The Masorti there in Israel, the conservative movement is there, and they are at the court every day, and they are at the political offices every day lobbying. But they need to know that from us, we support what they are trying to do. And we need to know that criticizing a policy such as this does not constitute a betrayal of the people of Israel. It does not constitute a betrayal of the state of Israel. To say that this is wrong is obvious and self-evident to everyone who is not self-interested in maintaining a status quo which is depriving the average Israeli of the right to get married by whomever they wished. It's already illegal for me to do a wedding in Israel. This will make it illegal for a woman to walk down the street with a kippah in Israel. And God knows what will happen to the Jewish institutions that allow Jews and to allow men and women to pray together. For all it will take is simply designating that as a holy site, and then the Orthodox will be allowed to change how that procedure can take place there as well. 3 Jews want to get together on Masada and have a little bit of a minyan because they are celebrating being in that wonderful place. Masada's been designated a holy site. Sorry. Now you have to follow their rules. This is the problem that is being faced, and we have an obligation to our brothers and sisters in Israel, if not to ourselves, to speak up about how unfair this is, how un-Jewish this is. Because remember, the Kotel isn't a synagogue. The tomb of Rambam is not a synagogue. It is not under the jurisdiction of a particular movement, or at least it should not be. These are places that are sacred in our heart, but not sacred in the way that a building such as this is. This is a place that holds deep memory, that holds deep passion, but it's not somewhere where we are designating it as a place solely for our traditional prayers. In those places, for each denomination, they should be allowed to practice as they want. As much as I am not a fan of having a mechitza, a dividing wall between men and women, if an Orthodox synagogue agrees that that's what they want, hareze meshubach, wonderful for them. This is fine. But there is no way they should be allowed to decree that upon the rest of us. Nor who we can or can't marry, nor who or can't officiate, nor which cemetery we could or could not be buried in. These are matters that have been handed over again and again and again, to the detriment of all. And to the detriment, by the way, of the non-religious Jews, the secular Israelis, who continue to have longer and longer time spent in the army and spent in the reserve each and every year, because while the Orthodox are taking away our freedoms to be able to worship as they want, they are refusing to shoulder the burden of defending the country that they are trying to control, refusing to take their place within the ranks of the IDF. They expect others to fight for their right to be able to tell them how they should or shouldn't pray. This has to stop, because Israel cannot survive if it continues to allow itself to be controlled in this way. Indeed, in another 20, 30, 50 years, if this trend continues along the same track that has been going for the last few decades, you will be hard-pressed to tell the difference between Israel then and the Ayatollahs of now. I already had a colleague who was attacked for walking down the street because she dared to have on a kippah. Attacked in the street for daring to believe in God. Attacked by other Jews. She had never been attacked in the US, which is where she was from, but in the streets of Yerushalayim, there she was attacked. And she wasn't attacked by Muslims. She wasn't attacked by Christians. She was attacked by our brothers because we let them. Because we have remained in our costume too long. Because we have allowed ourselves to be silenced for fear of being called hateful towards Israel, unsupportive of Israel. We have allowed ourselves to mute any criticism of that which needs to be criticized, and as such, the problem has grown worse and it has grown more painful for those people, not just for ourselves when we occasionally visit, but for the people who live there day after day, and not just for the conservative or the Reform Jews who are advocating, but for the secular Jews who have to share a ridiculous burden that is being put upon them by others who refuse to share in it, and for those that are Orthodox as well who do not realize that they have been trapped, tricked into a prison believing that their way is the only way, and are not even allowed to have a full education and full participation in the rest of the world, in the rest of the Jewish world. So who are we helping by keeping our mouth shut? What are we aiding by keeping the costume on? Yes, there was a time when we had to make a status quo compromise, as it's been called in the lingo of Israel for many decades. But that status quo isn't helping anyone right now, except the very, very tip of power. And they don't need our help. The people, all of the Jews in Israel, all of the people in Israel, and all of us, we are the ones who make up Am Yisrael. And we all have an obligation to work until each one of us is free, and free especially in the land of Israel. It's what we say in Hatikva. We will be chofshi. We will be free. It's time we actually meant it. Shabbat Shalom.